Hoo boy, last week was some pretty dark stuff. Popular pretty dark stuff, apparently. Thank you for that, but dark stuff nonetheless. So let's do something fun for a bit. Hey, you know what we haven't brought out in a while?
Comics are weird.
Yeah, that's the stuff. Okay, way the hell back in episode 21, Captains Courageous, we talked about Captain Marvel. No, the other one. And I mentioned that his presently more popular female counterpart, Ms. Marvel, could be a whole episode unto herself. Well, I was wrong about that. She's gonna need at least two. In the pantheon of female superheroes, Ms. Marvel, real name Carol Danvers, may not be the most well-known, the most unusual, or the most, developed, but she might be the most rebooted, rewritten, and reimagined of all. A one-woman Rosetta Stone, not only for comics being
Weird.
but also how they get
Especially weird.
when dealing with female characters. Alright, let's do this. So, Captain Marvel was an alien soldier turned superhero. Carol Danvers was a supporting character who first appeared in the second issue of his original series as an Air Force officer who was injured in an explosion during Mar-Vell's battle with a supervillain. That was 1968, and Carol Danvers would not be very important again for a whole decade. Round about 10 years later, they decided that the explosion had actually caused her to absorb some of Captain Marvel's alien energy, leading her to manifest similar powers of flight and super strength and take up the mantle of Ms. Marvel in her own solo series, which didn't last very long. Too bad, because today it's seen as having ended just as writer Chris Claremont, whom we'll get back to, don't worry, was getting a handle on it. Anyway, despite cancellation, the character of Ms. Marvel became a recurring staple of late 70s Marvel comics, making cameo appearances in dozens of different books opposite scads of different characters. By the 1980s, she most frequently appeared alongside the Avengers, and this is where things got icky. See, in 1980, the 200th issue of the Avengers was coming out, and to celebrate, they decided to do something big. The pitch, Ms. Marvel would have a baby. Now, setting aside how unbelievably lame and trite it is that the only two options for a big story with female characters always seems to be a baby or a wedding, the way they went about facilitating the little bundle of joy wound up being one of the most controversial and hated stories Marvel would ever publish. So here's the really shortened to the point version. Ms. Marvel wakes up out of nowhere pregnant and with no clue who the father is or where said impregnation ever occurred. The fetus has super fast gestation period and super fast aging once it's born, which seems to be the common thread in terrible fantasy stories about pregnancy, so in no time at all it grows up into a guy named Marcus who helpfully explains what's going on. It turns out Marcus is the son of an old Avengers villain named Immortus, who's way too complicated to explain here. Marcus had been trapped in the dimension of Limbo his whole life and wanted to come to Earth, but to do so he would have had to be reborn there. His solution? Abduct Ms. Marvel into Limbo and use his powers and his late father's technology of reality warping and mind control to create a romantic fantasy land in order to seduce her into becoming his lover. During their relations, he used even more of his magic and/or technology so that instead of impregnating her with his child, he impregnated her with, well, himself. Finally, he wiped out her memory and zapped her back to Earth so that he could then be born again in an Earth-compatible body. Yep. Take away all the sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, and Avengers 200 is a story about Ms. Marvel being abducted, raped, and then giving birth to her rapist, who essentially hijacked her womb to use as a trans-dimensional shuttle. And you thought this lady had issues. Not that the R word ever comes up. In fact, the Avengers don't seem to have much issue with what Marcus has done outside of the kidnapping. The whole Fantasyland, mind control, seduction, I'm my own baby daddy thing, everyone seems to regard as at worst curious and at best just impossibly romantic. Including Ms. Marvel. Once this is all out in the open and she remembers what's gone down, she is just all about Marcus again. The two of them ride off into the Limbo sunset to presumably begin a life of immortal, non-consensual, quasi-incestuous nuptials. And the Avengers just kinda stand around like, well, that was unusual, huh? Earth's mightiest heroes. Pretty good saving the planet, pretty good stopping a bank robbery, offering even the barest amount of proper counseling and/or support to a victim of obvious sexual assault. Not the first guys you should call, apparently. Believe it or not, making the Avengers' 200th adventure a kinda sorta mother-son unwilling sexual slavery as romance epic did not cause much of a stir. At all. Nobody really seemed to notice just how creepy and offensive and, well, horribly misogynist this whole story was. The high point of the outcry was a piece in the fanzine LOC by noted pop scholar and comic fan Carol A. Strickland titled The Rape of Ms. Marvel. Today, Strickland's brutal takedown is regarded as a big-ish turning point for the visibility of women in comic fandom, but it wasn't like fans were beating down Marvel's doors like you'd expect. But behind the scenes, the gears were turning. People in the industry, including people at Marvel, were not happy with what had happened to Carol Danvers, and one of them would eventually step forward and do something about it. And here we go again. Last episode ended with a rundown of Avengers number 200, the story of Ms. Marvel being kidnapped, brainwashed, impregnated against her will, and sent back to Earth to give birth to a reborn duplicate of the guy who kidnapped and pretty much raped her, whom she promptly fell madly in love and jetted off to another dimension with, while the Avengers did all to stop or even really question it. Yeah.
Comics are weird.
Depressingly, the general readership and industry didn't really seem all that bothered by this bafflingly creeptastic story, but at least a few people genuinely were. One of them was Marvel writer Chris Claremont. Claremont was pretty much Joss Whedon version 1.0. A genre writer noteworthy for his oddly matched skill sets at balancing continuity-driven ensemble stories and a surprisingly deft ability/preference for writing strong, multidimensional female characters. These days, it's fashionable to bust on his work for being convoluted and overly melodramatic, but from the 70s on into the 90s, he was one of the big guns rewriting the superhero rulebook. Most notably, he's the reason that pretty much anyone today knows who the X-Men are. People forget this, but that series was not popular in its original run. It was the reboot that Claremont helped launch and then pretty much dominated for over a decade that got people to actually care about them. But before the Mutants, Claremont had been a writer on Ms. Marvel's short-lived solo title, and he'd remained fond of her, so when he saw what had been done to the character in the now infamous Marcus story, he made it his personal mission to rescue her from editorial oblivion, a mission that began with writing Avengers Annual number 10 in 1981. It was an Avengers vs. Brotherhood of Evil Mutants story, with the bad guys currently led by Mystique, a character Claremont himself had created back in the original Ms. Marvel series. But the real focus turned out to be the secondary storylines, the mysterious discovery of a depowered Carol Danvers, aka Ms. Marvel, by Spider-Woman, and the debut of Mystique's new henchwoman Rogue, who was responsible for the aforementioned draining of Ms. Marvel's powers. Yeah, quick digression. Yes, Rogue started out as a bad guy working for Mystique, and in the comics she can take powers from anybody, not just other mutants. If you were ever wondering why the later good guy version of Rogue that most people know from the 90s comics and the Fox cartoon was also super strong and could fly, this is why. She had permanently absorbed Ms. Marvel's superpowers. And here comes the big save. It turns out that Ms. Marvel had been back from limbo, short version Marcus is dead, for some time, but never contacted the Avengers. Why? Well, she was pissed off at them for acting like a bunch of baby-blinded idiots last time around. She completely chews the Avengers out, along with by proxy the stupid story itself, for not, saving her from the guy who was clearly continuing to brainwash and force himself on her, and ultimately decides she's just gonna ditch them and hang out with the X-Men from now on instead. That's a burn. Mr. Claremont, take a bow. Oh, but he wasn't done yet. In her capacity as the X-Men's new no-powers human buddy, Carol Danvers got caught up in one of their many, many outer space adventures and wound up transformed into an even more powerful new character called Binary, who subsequently hooked up with the Starjammers. Yes, that's what they're called, a team of heroic space pirates led by Corsair, who is actually Christopher Summers, the long-lost father of Cyclops and Havoc and I've Gone Cross-Eyed. Anyway, things didn't stay fixed for long. Eventually, the Binary gig ran its course, and Carol made up with the Avengers, renaming herself Warbird for some reason, but she seems to be losing her mojo again, and Iron Man quickly figured out why. She was an alcoholic. After quitting the team, again, she cleaned up and started making appearances as regular old Ms. Marvel again throughout the early 2000s, though she declined officially rejoining the Avengers for the most part until House of M happened. Okay, to keep this from stretching into 3 episodes...
House of M was a 2005 miniseries set in an alternate universe built around making various characters' fondest wishes come true, created by Magneto's daughter, the Scarlet Witch, after the events of Avengers Disassembled that are too ridiculous to explain here. In her wish-come-true form, Carol Danvers appears as this universe's most beloved superhero under the name Captain Marvel. In the end, reality got set back to normal, but some, including Ms. Marvel, can remember what happened in the alternate reality.
So, since she enjoyed briefly being everyone's favorite hero, Ms. Marvel decides to really get her stuff together and make a go of it. And with help of her fans and the Marvel Comics writing staff, it pretty much worked. At present, she's probably the premier female hero of the Marvel Universe. At least until she was killed a few years ago during a brief period when the government had put the Avengers under the control of the Iron Patriot, aka Norman Osborn, aka the Green f***ing Goblin, and there it goes again, who in turn handed Ms. Marvel's identity to the pretending to be reformed supervillainous Moonstone. A few months later, the real Ms. Marvel was resurrected and took back her name and rank just in time to rejoin the restored Avengers where, at least last time I bothered checking in, Marvel was playing around with putting her in a romantic relationship with fellow team member Spider-Man. Because there's 2 people who really need more complications in their lives. And that's the story of Ms. Marvel. Oh, don't look at me like that. You weren't going to use those brain cells for anything important anyway. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.